Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite-Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite-Size Balance.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Bite-Size Balance. I'm telling you, recording these introductions is harder than doing the actual podcast interviews. I wish I could just put together a collection of outtakes of me trying to record introductions. It would be quite hilarious. Anyway, I'm hoping this is my last take on this. I had the pleasure of interviewing a fellow This Naked Mind certified coach, Kathryn Elliot, who lives in Melbourne, Australia, around her personal story of binge drinking and how she was able to change her drinking patterns, become free from alcohol, and eventually become certified as a coach. The reason I wanted to talk to Kathryn is because binge drinking is not the pattern that I was in. I was more of a habitual gray area drinker, was using alcohol more and more as a way to kind of cope, numb out, and chill out at the end of the day. Kathryn's story is very, very different, and binge drinking looks different from my story. And I know that for many of you, Kathryn's story will resonate. And she also has lots of really great expertise to share around the connection between drinking for women and breast cancer, and also just some really, I think, empowering and helpful thoughts around how you can stop binge drinking if this is a pattern that you've gotten into and it is no longer serving you. So, without any more chit chat, I'm going to end this because I feel like I said exactly what I needed to say about this episode. So enjoy this episode. Hi, Kathryn. How are you?
Wendy, I'm really well. How are you?
I'm pretty good. It's the end of the week on a Friday, and it is 20 to 5 here where I am, and where you are, it is 20 to 8 in the morning. So it's really interesting. We're at the opposite. It's actually tomorrow where you are. It's Saturday morning.
Yeah, the weekend, sun shining. It's summer here too.
Oh yeah, it's winter here. Actually, I just posted a video of ducks like landing on a frozen lake. So wow. We're at complete opposites in all ways today. So I was saying to Kathryn before we hit record, I'm less focused at the end of the day because I am old and because I'm in menopause. So I'm going to do my absolute best with this, but I know Kathryn's story is going to resonate with so many of you. And I'm just really happy to have her here to be able to talk about another side of drinking that is different from the gray area drinking that I talk about a lot on this podcast. So why don't we start with, because we're going to be talking about binge drinking today, Kathryn. So why don't we start with telling people what binge drinking is? Do you want to explain what the difference between binge drinking and maybe what we would consider more habitual drinking is, and how to know if you're a binge drinker?
Yeah, so I guess very simply, binge drinking is drinking a lot in one session. And that, you know, different countries have different levels, but in Australia, for women, it's 4 or more standard drinks in one session. And generally that they now look at that drinking 4 or more drinks in a couple of hours. Yeah. But, you know, the standard drinks in Australia are now quite small. So many people might be binge drinkers now and not even realise it. Mm-hmm. But I guess what I've noticed from my experience and from talking to clients who classify as binge drinkers, it's people who have a long pattern of, I guess, drinking a lot at events, at occasions, on weekends. So they might be drinking Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, Sunday, but then more often than not, they'll then abstain for a period of time during the week. So they're not generally drinking every day, right? And they don't find taking time off drinking necessarily as difficult as someone who's habitually drinking every day. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And so when I think of binge drinking, I always think of like my university days when I would go out once, sometimes twice a week, although I couldn't really handle that or afford it. And we would drink, we drink a lot. We'd start drinking at 7:30 or 8 o'clock and we'd keep drinking till 1, 2 in the morning, and then we'd go to bed, and that would be the end of it. And I wouldn't think about drinking again until the next Saturday night. And I think that what is different between you and me is that I did that for a period of time and then left it altogether. And for me, I really didn't drink very much at all for many, many years after university. But then once I got, into a really stressful part of my career and I had my kids and my life just started to feel overwhelming, I started drinking as a way to relieve stress. But then for me, it was just, in the beginning, it was just maybe one drink once in a while to relieve stress. And that slowly over time grew to a couple of drinks, and it just became more regular and more drinks. Whereas for someone who is a binge drinker, and you're going to tell your story in a second, presumably that's been a pattern for a long time, the binge drinking, and it doesn't stop in the same way as it did for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started as a binge drinker probably when I was about 15, 16, and took that pattern of drinking throughout my whole, university, young adulthood, having children into my 40s. And even though at times I tried to manage it, moderate my binge drinking, there was never a year, unless I was pregnant, when there wouldn't be what I would classify as a couple of real blowout binge events that happened. And so what I notice from the people I talk to who have binge drinking issues is that more often than not, it is a pattern of drinking that has started early on in life, and that they, for whatever reason, have never been able to break it. And often binge drinkers also are blackout drinkers as well. So it can be a very dangerous type of drinking, given blackouts occur and there are, parts of nights that are literally erased from our memories.
Yeah. Yeah. And just for anyone listening who's thinking, oh, that's the Australia guideline for binge drinking, but I live in the States or I live in Canada. What's the guideline here? It's the same here. So it's 4 drinks within about 2 hours. And it's if you're a wine drinker, for example, it's 4 or 5 ounce glasses of wine, which is not a very big glass of wine. So, when you actually sit down and look at it, as Kath said, you might actually be binge drinking more often than you are. And what we know is that in North America, binge drinking or heavy drinking for women has gone up significantly since the start of the pandemic, which is another reason I wanted to have this conversation with you, because if you're struggling with this and you're thinking to yourself right now, oh my gosh, I regularly, like every weekend, at least a couple of the nights on the weekend, I'm having 4 drinks over the course of the evening. You're not alone. The statistic is that heavy drinking in women is up 41%. So Kathryn, why don't you take a little time and kind of tell us what binge drinking looked like for you, and how it progressed and how you got to a point where you decided it was time to make a change?
Yeah, sure. So binge drinking started for me like most, I think, Australians as a teenager. So I started drinking when I was about 14, I think. And if I look back, there was always something really enticing about alcohol for me, even as a young girl. I enjoyed the feeling of losing control. I wasn't the type of person who got really sick when I drank. I had quite a tolerance for alcohol compared to other girls. So I was able to drink quite a lot. And in Australia, in the 80s, when I was growing up as a teenager, I was friends with lots of young men, and I guess I got a reputation of being a big drinker and a good drinker, and that made me feel good. And so it became part of my identity from 16, 17, 18, that I could stay up with the boys, I could drink with the boys. And that's really when I guess my binge drinking really, I guess, got hold of me in a way where I was drinking a lot every weekend, probably Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday night, and then I wouldn't drink much during the week at all. And I took that through school, into university. And, interestingly, looking back, I can see that in my university days, there were lots of warning signs with my binge drinking. I was blacking out quite regularly. I'd started to wet the bed on occasions. I was having some really, I guess, ugly arguments and fights with my boyfriend at the time, many of which I couldn't remember. I'd also drunk and drove at one point in time when I was highly intoxicated. Luckily, nothing happened to me or to anyone else. So there was this pattern of really dangerous and reckless behaviour that had started to happen. And I also became often very angry and a bit out of control when I was drinking as well. And also making decisions in relationships that weren't great. So I also, now I look back, often when I was in long-term relationships, I would cheat on my partner because I was really drunk and then wouldn't own up to it. So there was just a pattern of really kind of reckless behaviour. Mm-hmm. And as I went in from uni to working in a job in my and traveling overseas, again, I was binge drinking the whole time. So when I was backpacking in Europe, I did a lot of binge drinking. Nothing horrendous happened, but it was all very lucky, I guess, in many ways. That's what I put it down to. I was at a backpackers, I remember, and in Portugal, and had a really big night and woke up and I, wet the bed at the backpackers. It was horrendously embarrassing, but I just got used to covering it up, and I'd just sort of take out my sleeping bag and rinse it out in water and hang it over the bed and hope for the best. And one occasion that came up for me the other day, which was really interesting, was I remember being out with a whole group of people. We were all staying in a bunk room we're all staying in the bunk room together. I was sleeping next to my boyfriend at the time in the bunk, and again I drank and I wet the bed, and he actually told everyone that it was him. I remember thinking, what a great person, because I was really embarrassed. And I remember him saying to me, it hadn't happened before with him, but he said, is this something that's happened before? And I didn't tell the truth. I was like, I'm not going to tell him. But yeah, so that there was definitely a pattern and many warning signs. And even when I got married, I was working in a, quite a high-powered PR marketing job. I was still binge drinking. I never, ever drank really at work events. That was one. Even though I was a binge drinker, I did have rules. And sometimes, working for me was just a no-go zone. And so, interestingly enough, some of the people that I've worked with are like, I can't believe that you've come out and said you had a binge drinking problem. You were never really drunk at events. And I was like, yeah, that's my controlled part of my personality. That was off limits. But when events were on limits, that was when I often really lost control with drinking. And it wasn't every weekend and it wasn't every event. But what I found is that there was always, at least, as I said, a couple of events a year where I would end up in a place the next morning feeling so much shame and disappointment with where I'd got to. And I think that's something that binge drinkers, I think, really feel, is this deep sense of shame and feeling alone. They don't often feel seen, because binge drinking is very normalized in many cultures around the world. It's seen as part of, a rites of passage when you're teenagers and growing up. And it's seen as something that everyone does it, but then quite a lot of people grow out of it. And then what I know to be true is, yes, quite a few people do grow out of it, but a lot of people don't grow out of it. Yeah. In fact, they take it through their life until their 50s, 60s and 70s. And if you don't do anything about it, it's actually very, very hard to break an ingrained destructive binge drinking cycle. And for me, I guess the two big events that really made me stop and do something about it seriously was my brother's wedding in 2013. So that was just in my early 40s. I was part of the bridal party. I got horrendously drunk and was then incredibly rude to my mum and said some really horrible things to her that night. And I couldn't remember them. I woke up the next morning and thought it was a bad dream, and then had to try and piece the night together. I looked at my phone the next morning and my mum had sent me a message, and I realised that I needed to go over and have a conversation with her. I had a sore hand because I'd fallen over at the end of the night and grazed myself. And so this was kind of a pattern for what happened if I really had a night that I didn't remember. I would often, fall over and hurt myself. My husband would often have to try and, help manage getting me home. And I think I was lucky that I had a partner for, most of that time, in that he was kind of protecting and making sure that I got home okay as well. Mm-hmm. And then the second event that happened was we were on a family holiday a couple of years later maybe, and where I drank a lot of cocktails over at a friend's house and the kids were with us. And I remember getting the next round of espresso martinis, and then the next thing I remember is waking up in the apartment with a really sore head, not from a hangover, but I had fallen back and hit my head in front of the kids really heavily, and they were really, really worried about me and thought that I was going to die. And they were all crying the next day and saying, "Mummy, what was wrong with you?" So at that moment, I thought to myself, I have a problem, I have a problem that I want to really solve now. I don't want to keep living in this cycle of binging and then punishing myself by abstaining for, I often stopped drinking for a month or two, but then I'd go back to it because I hadn't really done the proper work on my own binge drinking cycle, my own drinking history, why I was drinking. And until I did that work and realised that moderation wasn't going to work for a binge drinker like me, that I wasn't able to change my life. And that's one of the pieces that binge drinkers find incredibly difficult to stomach, is that binge drinking is as much of a problem as any other type of drinking. It is an addiction in itself. It's an addiction more for social and event type drinking, but some people also binge drink at home as well. So there's also an element of that too.
Just interrupt, because I'm thinking as you're talking and people are trying to figure out like the difference here, because I've said this to you before we started recording the podcast. I said to you, I mean, it's not like I haven't had episodes where I would absolutely fall into the binge drinking category, and also episodes over the course of my lifetime where I have woken up the next morning and thought, oh gosh, a lot of that's fuzzy. I am lucky in that blackouts are not part of my story. I've never blacked out, but I wonder if it's, I hear this a lot from women. They have to recreate the night before. They can't remember what happened. They are checking their phone. They've often lost things. They can't find their phone, or they can't find their keys, or they've lost their friend that they were with, or whatever. But I wonder if what you're talking about is, that once it's like that, I hear that articulated this way a lot. I don't have an off switch. So once I start, I can't stop. And a lot of the women I work with say that. And that is not really the way I felt about drinking. I didn't have that. I was able to stop. It didn't mean that I stopped when I should, but I could stop. And so it was it was unusual for me to have a night. I mean, after college, I'm talking about like when I was, in the last 10 years of my drinking, unusual for me to have a night where I drank so much that I was just incredibly hungover and sick the next day, or couldn't remember parts of the night or whatever. So I think I did have that off switch where at a certain point I'd just be like, I'm tired. I'm just going to go to bed, And so I wonder if that's kind of what you're talking about with binge drinking. It's that feeling of like not having an off switch when you start, which would explain why moderation is is really tricky, just like it is for a habitual drinker like me, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've hit the nail on the head there. It is that off switch that is really difficult for binge drinkers. They actually don't have it. And it's because physiologically, their pattern of drinking and how they've learnt to drink, their body and their brain has got so used to expecting a huge hit of alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
So often binge drinkers will drink a lot when they start drinking. So rather than just sitting on 1 or 2 drinks, I could have had 4 to 6 drinks in the first hour. And
Right.
that is, and so our body and brain get used to that hit. So that's what it craves. And that's why it's really hard to pull on that off switch. And when I talk to other binge drinkers, they absolutely feel the same way, that's what happens. The first drink sends them into this huge it's a huge craving for more, but more quickly. And the way that they drink is different to someone who's just, as I said, sitting on a drink for an hour or so. It really is a kind of, it's this sort of physiological push to drink more.
It's intense, and there's like a speed to it. So there's a pace to it that's not maybe the pace that I might have drank for longer and just drank more over a longer period of time, but not as many drinks in a shorter period of time. So I guess it's the pace is a piece of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even though we've talked about the classification of 4 drinks as being kind of, the guideline for a binge. I mean, a binge drinker is drinking a hell of a lot more than that, right? Yeah. They're probably drinking 12, 16, 20 standard drinks. So it's a huge jump from 4 to where the binge drinker finishes off at the end of the night generally.
Right. Yeah. So at what point did you decide? So you talked about these 2 particular moments that were really, really problematic for you. Maybe what some would call rock bottom moments, just moments when it was obvious to you that, you needed to make a change. So what was the moment? Like when was the point? Because this is something that I talk to my clients about all the time. Nobody ever really knows when it's going to be their last time drinking, for sure. For most of us, there are many false starts in that. And, but at some point, as long as you just keep going and you keep trying and you keep focusing and staying in, curiosity and self-compassion, as we talk about in This Naked Mind, eventually you will look back and say, oh, I guess that was my last drink. So I'm just curious, did you know it was your last drink? How did that go for you?
Yeah, I didn't know it was definitely my last drink, but something changed in my mindset. I decided that I was going to stop drinking for an indefinite period of time rather than doing what I'd always done, which was I'm going to stop for a month or 2 or 3 months and have an end date. Right. Because that gives a binge drinker a permission to have another binge, basically, at the end of the abstinence period. So what's very typical of binge drinkers is they'll put themselves into abstinence for a long period of time if they've had some bad binges, and it's kind of like self-punishment. They prove to themselves that they don't have a problem. They're not physically reliant on alcohol. They don't really even necessarily miss it that much. Occasionally socially, but there's this kind of whole thinking. You get used to putting yourself into exile. And so for me, I realized that this was actually all part of my cycle, was putting myself in exile, then letting myself out, and then of course I'd end up binging again. So my mindset changed. It was 2019, and do you know what? It wasn't just an aha moment. This was a slow build over, I think, probably 6 years. I'd been open and curious. I was really aware that I had a problem and wanted to do something about it. I was trying different things, but that was because I still hadn't let go the idea of moderation and still wanting to drink. And so I needed to go through that process to work out for myself what was working in my life and what wasn't. And so the mindset shift that changed for me was that I realized I was open to the possibility that I could no longer moderate, and I was going to see what life was like without drinking, without a time frame of saying, oh, you can go back to drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I had then also started listening to This Naked Mind podcast. I had started reading Annie's book, and I signed up for the July 2019 alcohol experiment. And so I started listening to all the daily material and got pretty immersed in that group. And that was really life-changing for me, because there was a community out there. I could see that there were all sorts of people all over the world who had their own struggles with alcohol. Some who were binge drinkers, many who weren't binge drinkers. But for me, it gave me permission to, I guess, show myself some self-compassion, because I'd been so hard on myself as well. I'd been really whipping myself that I couldn't manage this drinking issue that I had, and that I felt was really holding me back in my life. And so as I got through that month, I started to realize that I could do this. But interestingly enough, I remember my last night of drinking very clearly, because I was starting on the 1st of July. I'd decided that was when I was starting the live alcohol experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And that was when I was moving into a period of not drinking. And I was watching Australian rules football. I've got my favourite team, Carlton, who I barracked for. They were playing, and I got quite drunk. I drank probably a bottle and a half of red wine. I got really emotional because it was a very close game. I remember crying, and I remember just feeling really kind of numb and hazy. And I remember thinking, this feeling is I'm really looking forward to not feeling like this.
Mm-hmm.
Woke up the next morning with my last kind of hangover, which was just, a dry mouth, feeling, under the weather, just not, I wasn't able to go to the gym because I felt too tired. And that was the last time I drank. And I guess every month that went by, it became easier and harder in some ways. And I obviously had a curveball thrown in literally 2 months after I stopped drinking, which, is another piece to this story, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the curveball. So you had stopped drinking, you'd been 2 months alcohol free. And then what happened?
Then one morning I'd just been at the gym. I had started to feel really good. I was sleeping better because I wasn't drinking. And I ran out of the bathroom I just bought this new floor to wall length mirror. And for some reason, I just thought, I've got to go and have a look at myself, just look at my body. Hadn't done it for ages. And I stood in front of the mirror, and my eyes were immediately drawn to my right breast. I could see this kind of dimpled skin. I was like, oh my gosh, what's that? And my hands went to it straight away, and I could feel this really quite large lump in my right breast, which my immediate instinctual kind of reaction was to try and push the lump into my breast. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's huge. So my heart, I knew right then and there that something really serious was going on. I'd never had a lump in either of my breasts before. And I called my husband. He came up. He was like, yeah, that's quite big. But it was like it had come out of nowhere. I'd had a breast check at the GP literally 9 months earlier. Nothing had been picked up. And within 2 days of finding that lump, I had a diagnosis of locally advanced breast cancer. I was starting a huge treatment plan of chemotherapy basically within the week. And then I started 16 rounds of chemo. I had surgery, radiation therapy, targeted therapy. I had the whole treatment shebang for 15 to 18 months it was. And so it was a massive shock to my life, but it was the most traumatic and the most transformational thing that has ever happened to me. It has changed my life. It's been a gift in every possible way, although I would not wish breast cancer or any type of cancer on anyone. I have been able to take so many positives from it that I am very grateful to the way that I have been able to process it and use it for good in my life. I don't think I'd be an alcohol coach if I hadn't gone through breast cancer. I wouldn't be working in the volunteer role that I work in now with one of the breast cancer organisations here. So it has given me much more a life of purpose and a life that I really appreciate the normal, ordinary moments in life. They are where the gifts in life are, not in, I guess, for me, I put so much emphasis on the future and what I didn't have. And now I realize what I have is so incredible, and that the love of friends and family is literally and the love for yourself is the three most important things in life. And I think, in relation to alcohol, there was a moment when I was diagnosed when I thought, oh my gosh, I have never been through a really traumatic event in my life without drinking. How am I going to do this? And I thought to myself, if I can do this without drinking, I can do anything in my life. Yeah. And also, I guess for me, I was the type of person, when I got the diagnosis, I wanted all the knowledge. So I literally bought so many books. I did so much research about breast cancer, the type of breast cancer I had, which was triple positive, which was driven by both hormones and also another protein called HER2. And so for me, I was like, I've got to get as much information. And so I started to then look at the relationship between alcohol and breast cancer and the links between alcohol consumption and breast cancer. And I was really, I guess, shocked, intrigued, and in some ways a bit relieved to find out that there is quite a strong link between alcohol consumption and breast cancer, particularly estrogen-driven breast cancer, which is the breast cancer that I had. And yeah, when I say relief, I guess for me, it was like I'd taken, I had this lifestyle factor for many years in my life, binge drinking, which was very unhealthy. And so I don't know whether that caused the cancer that I had, but I guess intuitively and instinctually, it makes me feel better to think that it contributed to it, because now that I've taken that out of my life and that's something I have control over, I feel so empowered that is something that I no longer do. And there's a lot of studies around and have been for since the 80s, I guess, about the links between alcohol consumption and breast cancer, and they all, I guess, have different percentages that come out of them. But I guess for me, what was really interesting was that I had been under the impression that it was really just extremely heavy drinkers that would have a risk of breast cancer through alcohol consumption. And what I realised through the research was that is not the case, that low to moderate drinking can increase your risk of breast cancer. So even just a drink per day, so 7 drinks a week, increases your risk of breast cancer by approximately 14%. That is quite a compelling statistic.
It's mind-blowing. I think actually newer research indicates that just 2 to 3 drinks a week can do that. So, and the piece that I want, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I did want to flag this for anyone listening. And I know you're aware of this, Kathryn, but probably lots of people aren't. Recent studies indicate that only about 25% of women actually know that there's a link between breast cancer and alcohol. Like, we're just not talking about this very much. It's slowly becoming something we're talking about more, and I'm seeing more news media and coverage on this now, which is fantastic. And I know that this is a topic that you're really passionate about, is just, and of course, one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on to talk about this is just to say, it's actually quite a large risk. And it is, as you say, not just for people who are habitually heavy drinkers, for women who are drinking a lot every day. The risk is there for binge drinkers, and the risk is there also for pretty light drinkers. And so it is something that we need to start talking more about and understanding. And I love the fact that you can say now that you've taken back some control over really quite a large factor potentially in this, right? When you think percentage wise, we spend so much time worrying about so many different things when it comes to cancer. And it's not to say that we shouldn't worry about those, but if you go look at the risk statistics on some of these other things that we spend a lot of time thinking about, this risk is pretty clear now, and it's pretty high.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely it is. And I think, I think for people who are drinking and who aren't even looking at stopping drinking, even a reduction in any amount of drinking per week reduces the risk of breast cancer.
Yep.
So even if you're out one night and you choose to have 2 less drinks, that is great. That is important.
Yeah.
So that's what I tell my friends who are, low to moderate drinkers. Anytime you can have off drinking is really, really important.
Yeah.
And that it starts as soon as we start to reduce our drinking, we reduce our risk of breast cancer. As women, we all have an increased, just being born a woman, we all have an increased risk of breast cancer. It's 1 in 8. And then if we're drinking, we're increasing that risk with every drink that we consume per day. And I'm really interested. There hasn't been a huge amount of research done on binge drinking and breast cancer, but the small amount of research that has been done is showing that binge drinking, episodic drinking, definitely has a link with higher rates of breast cancer. So that for me is very compelling. And as I said, in a way, it was relieving as well for me, that I'm now living without drinking, and I've taken that lifestyle factor.
Yeah. For so many women, I think that whether it's breast cancer or it's another health risk, maybe a family history, like it was for me, of just incredibly high risk of colon cancer in my family, both of my parents and two grandparents. So the risk is super high in my family. And I've been terrified since my dad was 35 when he was diagnosed with colon cancer, so quite young as well. So I've been terrified my whole life of getting colon cancer. And there's a large connection between alcohol and colon cancer risk as well. So that for me, when I stopped drinking, was also really empowering. Like, I've taken back control over this one piece of risk. So I think, and I love this idea of harm reduction. Anything less you can drink is worth not drinking. And so this is where all those conversations I've had on this podcast with so many other guests and just my own solo podcasts around, mocktails and giving yourself permission to not drink and trying new things and, asking for alcohol, if there's an alcohol-free beverage on the menu. All of these steps actually really add up and matter, whether you stop drinking altogether or not. So I absolutely agree with you, Kathryn, on that. The less you drink, the better. So anywhere you have the opportunity to have a glass of water, soda, or a mocktail instead of an alcoholic beverage, great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
Very good advice.
So we've talked about your story around binge drinking. And then at a certain point, you became certified with This Naked Mind. And now you coach around this. And your real focus and specialty as a coach is around binge drinking and helping people change their binge drinking patterns. But I'm curious what the approach is that you take when you're working with people who are trying to change their binge drinking. Because as you've said, it sounds like with binge drinking, it's very seldom the case that there is an option there that's workable around moderation. So What's the approach, the advice that you take with your clients?
Yeah. So generally the clients who come to me with a binge drinking pattern, generally they have not felt heard or seen in this conversation, which is because they hear so much around people who are drinking every day. A lot of them are very functional, living really functional lives, but they feel like they've been, I guess, harboring this dirty little secret of, right. And when we talk about binges, I'm talking about it's sort of really bad binge drinking. So even though, as you discussed a lot, this classification, there's probably a lot more people binge drinking than they think. These people who are binge drinking are generally people who are blacking out, who are not remembering many parts of nights, who have been doing it for a long, long period of time since they've been teenagers.
Yeah.
And part of the process that I take them through is actually looking at the patterns and where they started, so they get an understanding, because what's happened often is they're so ashamed that they're really even just too scared to look back. And so I give them permission to let's look back, let's see what's happened, so that you can release a lot of this shame that you've been holding on to. And even that part of the process is so relieving for them, because they're doing that in an environment with someone who knows exactly how it feels and has been through the experience. Mm-hmm. So that is actually a big part of the experience for them, is to release a lot of that shame, which as you know happens with lots of clients. That for them feels so good and is part of the healing process. Mm-hmm. But then what we then look at is, once we look at their history and their patterns, everyone has different triggers as well. So what becomes very apparent when we start doing the work is that there's certain groups of people that are triggers, there are certain environments that are triggers, there are certain types of drinks that are triggers as well. So often binge drinkers will have a certain drink that is their go-to binge drink. So or that will send them over the edge. And even isolating that and looking at that is really important, because sometimes even switching the drink for a while when they're trying to look at their drinking, that can really help as well. So one client at the moment that I'm working with, red wine is literally the binge drink, and that's been taken off the table now. That is just a non-negotiable. Mm-hmm. And so another part of what we look at is this whole idea of the cycle that they've been putting themselves through and what that looks like. So we talk through that cycle, which it starts with kind of the binge, but then often they put themselves into, as I've talked about, abstaining for a certain period of time. Fading effect bias comes in because we give ourselves a pat on the back because we haven't been drinking. We don't really have a problem with alcohol because, look, we haven't drunk for 2, 3, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Yeah. So then giving themselves permission to go back again, and then the eventual kind of binge will happen, no off switch. So just looking and mapping that out is really important, so they can see it. And then we look at certain occasions that have happened, binges, bad ones, and they're like, oh my gosh, that all makes sense. And then we just talk through, okay, so what's the common factor here? That's alcohol, a certain type of drink. And then over time, even if they want to moderate, they start to come to an understanding that they're going to need a certain period of time, quite a long period of time away from drinking, just to break this kind of cycle that happens every 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of the process that we go through.
Yeah. So presumably they have to do the same. It's the same approach as any drinker, in that they need to learn how to do all the things that they did with alcohol, which for binge drinkers might be more specific and might be less regular. But those things that they associate with alcohol and with heavy alcohol use, they need to experience those without alcohol. So they need to learn that they can go and have fun. And then presumably you're also addressing those underlying beliefs that they have around what the substance is doing for them in those circumstances and why they need it. Just like I do working with the demographic that I work with.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a big part of it as well, because it's often, that's where the addictions really take hold, in those social event type situations, weekend situations. So even practicing those situations without drinking. And there are often a lot of beliefs of, many people who have been binge drinkers have this idea that they're the party person, that they've been the fun person, the person to be at the party at the end of the night. And so there's a huge part of their identity that is often connected to binge drinking, and dealing with that, thinking that everyone's going to think I'm really boring without drinking.
Yeah.
So,
I can see how that would be the big one there, which is not as much, maybe as often the case for someone who is drinking by themselves, or less but more regularly. That makes total sense to me. All of those social beliefs that are probably tied up and wrapped up in all of that. So Kathryn, what would you suggest if there's someone listening to this podcast who's thinking, oh, that's my pattern, I'm a binge drinker? First of all, let me just remind you and reiterate that you're not alone in this. This is so common. And it obviously is a spectrum, the binge drinking, because as I said, I mean, the majority of the women that I drink with are drinking 4 drinks in a sitting. Like, that is not an unusual thing at all. So it's, it is a spectrum. And there are, we've talked about how there's kind of this extreme binge drinking pattern for a lot of people where there are breaks in between these binges. But if you are someone and you're thinking, oh, that's me, that's my pattern, that's been me for a while, and it's not serving me anymore, and I really want to change it, what would you suggest as a first step?
Well, I think the first step is actually taking responsibility for the fact that you have a problem, and that's a great place to be. Owning the problem is so important. And what I have noticed and what I've witnessed with binge drinkers is that they do need some coaching on their thoughts and beliefs around drinking. It's very difficult to leave an entrenched binge drinking pattern behind without doing some work on your thoughts and beliefs. So even starting to write out some of the thoughts and beliefs that you have around your drinking and your binge drinking is really important. Journaling is really important. Many of my clients have found journaling is such a release of a lot of stuff for them. But I think the thing that I would say to anyone that's listening that identifies is that you're absolutely not alone. There are so many people who do relate to a binge drinking pattern. And I think the fact is, if you think you have a problem, you generally do have a problem. And that the first thing that you can, I guess, do about it is just start to get curious, start to do some reading, start to listen to some podcasts, start to find, there's a great book called Blackout by Sarah McCallum. Which is about, that's kind of a binge drinking kind of memoir, which, I found really useful when I was along the journey. And then obviously and I think we talked about, you mentioned it, but in Alcohol Explained, there's a couple of really good chapters on binge drinking and blackouts that really make sense from a science perspective as well. Because I think if you're sitting in a bit of shame around what's happened, just to understand that it's not your fault. This is something that, that happens with alcohol. Just because physiologically you're having blackouts, it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you. It's actually very normal. It's a very normal response to drinking a lot of alcohol quickly. The amygdala cannot deal with lots of alcohol. So that's why our our long-term memory gets shut off because it doesn't adapt to alcohol abuse. So that's why we only have a 2-minute loop.
Right. And it's so we didn't talk about blackouts very much, but in a blackout, the most amazing thing about someone in a blackout is that they're still functioning. They're fully functioning in the moment, and no one knows they're actually blacked out, and they don't know they've blacked out until they can't remember what happened the night before. And they realize, and people will say, oh no, you were doing this. And then you were over there dancing. And then in some cases, like then you got in a car, or then you did whatever. So it is really fascinating. And I absolutely loved Blackout by Sarah Hepola. And it is, and I'm not a blackout drinker, but I found it fascinating. And I definitely related to parts of it, even though I'm not a blackout drinker. And I think it would be a very helpful book to read if you are identifying with what we're talking about today with binge drinking. So thanks for reminding people of that. I echo the Alcohol Explained, and also This Naked Mind, obviously, we're both big fans of. So that would be a really great place to start. And then Kathryn, people can find you on your website, which is
the alcoholmindsetcoach.com.
Okay. I'll put that in the show notes so that if people want more information or you want to follow Kathryn online, she is the Alcohol Mindset Coach. That has been so helpful for me. And I think I can confidently say that there will be many people who listen to this episode with whom your story resonates and who found that really, really helpful. So thank you for sharing so honestly. I am such a big believer in what I know you're a big believer in, which is that shame really can only exist in a vacuum. And as soon as we talk about our stories and share our stories, it has the instant effect of dissolving shame. And so I really appreciate and love the fact that you shared so honestly what your experience was with binge drinking. And I think it'll be really helpful to lots of people who are listening. So thanks for being here today, Kathryn.
Thanks, Wendy. I really enjoyed talking to you. And I completely agree that I remember thinking to myself about 12 months ago that I would never publicly be able to admit that I had wet the bed. And I have just done it. So I feel really good. It's layers that get released all the time. There are often parts of our stories that we think we'll never be able to share because of the shame. And so part of what I've given myself permission to do is to keep pushing and keep releasing. And so I feel very honored that I was able to do it with you on your podcast.
Oh, well, I very, very much appreciate it. And I absolutely agree with that. I am absolutely astounded at some of the things I share now that if I had thought back, 5-10 years ago, would just never have thought it was possible that I have shared some of the things that I have shared about myself on this podcast. Not just in relation to alcohol, but in relation to so many other things that I know are shared stories that other women can relate to. So thank you again. And I hope you have a wonderful sunny Saturday. I'm going to go enjoy my Friday night.
Yeah, thanks so much, Wendy. It was amazing. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a certified Naked Mind coach, I help busy women like you find freedom from alcohol. If you're starting to question your relationship with alcohol, you'll want to listen to my free 3-part video series where I address the top 3 myths around why you think you need to drink. Sign up now at www.wendymccallum.com/myths. That's www.wendymccallum.com/myths.